The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Power and Partnership, Africa in the Global Order with Chidi Blyden. Presented in partnership with the Alaska World Affairs Council. Africa is increasingly central to global politics, not just a stage for external powers, but an arena of strategic decision-making. Drawing on her experience in defense and diplomacy, Blyden will explore the opportunities, challenges, and strategic calculations that define Africa's role in the evolving global order. Chidi Blyden is the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs.
Well, good evening. It is a genuine pleasure to be here in Alaska, a state renowned for its breathtaking landscapes and resilient communities. I want to thank the Alaska World Affairs Council and the Juneau World Affairs Council for convening us in Juneau, a city that embodies Alaska's frontier spirit and global significance. In Washington, where I'm from, we often talk about taking the long view. Here in Alaska, that principle is lived every day. You don't just read about global dynamics, you witness them firsthand, whether in the shifting ice, evolving trade routes, or the enduring sovereignty of indigenous communities. I recently returned from a trip to Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and Luanda, Angola. When I told colleagues there that I was coming to Alaska to discuss Africa defense, development, and diplomacy, I was met with some surprise. Why would a former US defense and development official with a focus on the global South travel to the farthest reaches of the American North? On a flat map, Alaska and Africa seem worlds apart. One a frozen north, the other the sunny tropics. But the globe tells a different story. In the interconnected 21st century economy, distance is not what it seems. Africa and the Arctic are in many ways strategic cousins, distant cousins. But both are defined by vast, challenging geographies and are frontiers where natural resources underpin economic and political power. Both are home to indigenous communities whose ways of life and governance systems are continually shaped by external pressures. Tonight, I want to close that perceived distance. I want to try and explain why melting ice in the Beaufort Sea is connected to cobalt mines in the Congo, and why the African diaspora is not just part of Alaska's past, but integral to its future. And why in an era of US, China, Russia competition, Africa and Alaska are not peripheral, they are central. After all, Alaska was home to the Trump-Putin summit last year, where the presidents of two great superpowers came together to try and seek common ground on geopolitical issues. Alaska as a location was not chosen by accident. The United States' foreign policy is currently being shaped by dynamic debates around key regions and resources. In Greenland, US's interests have intensified as melting ice opens up new shipping lanes and exposes vast stores of rare earth minerals, prompting competition not only with Russia, but with China, which has sought to invest heavily in Greenland's mining sector. In Venezuela, the world's largest proven oil reserves remain a focal point of US sanctions policy and diplomatic maneuvering, with Washington balancing pressure for democratic reforms against energy market stability. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country and a major oil producer, is central to US engagement on energy, security, counterterrorism, and democracy promotion. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, sits at the heart of the global critical minerals conversation. The DRC supplies over 70% of the world's cobalt, indispensable for electric vehicle batteries, clean energy technologies, making it a geopolitical flashpoint for US, Chinese, and European interests. These debates are not isolated, they are deeply interconnected, and their outcomes will shape the future of global supply chains, climate strategy, and international alliances. But for now, let's ground this discussion in Juneau, Alaska's capital and a hub for tourism, resource management, and indigenous governance. In 2023, Juneau welcomed over 1.6 million cruise ship visitors, making tourism a 375 million engine for the local economy. Beyond tourism, Juneau is also the administrative heart of Alaska's unique governance model, where Alaska Native corporations and tribal entities play a central role in land stewardship and economic development, models that resonate with indigenous communities worldwide, and especially in Africa. This is not so different, like I said, from many African countries. So let me provide a few quick statistics about Africa for the novices in the room. Africa is the world's second largest and second most populous continent. 54 nations, over 1.4 billion people, and unmatched diversity. With a median age of about 20 years old, Africa is the world's youngest continent and will reach 1.5 billion people by 2026. Africa's geography is vast, 30.3 million square kilometers bounded by the Mediterranean, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and the Atlantic. Its natural resources are immense, from the forests of the Congo Basin, often called the world's second lung, which emits the equivalent of 10 years of global carbon dioxide emissions, to the mineral-rich lands that fuel global industries. Africa's economy is dynamic. While agriculture remains central, the continent hosts some of the world's largest oil reserves in Nigeria, Libya, Sudan, Angola. And it's a hub for critical minerals essential to the global energy transition, technology, and artificial intelligence. Tourism is also an economic pillar, with Africa's unique flora and fauna and over 30,000 kilometers of coastline drawing millions of visitors annually. Like Alaska, many African nations leverage natural wonders and cultural heritage to drive sustainable growth. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to witness one of Alaska's great wonders, your glaciers, specifically the Mendenhall Glacier. The most visible change here in Alaska is the horizon itself. We're witnessing a fundamental shift from an era of unconstrained globalization to one defined by resource competition and strategic access. As Arctic ice recedes, the northern sea route is shifting from theory to reality. Alaska's position is changing. You're becoming a connector within the global system, not just a remote outpost. Juneau's bustling port and tourism sector are already feeling the ripple effects of increased maritime traffic and shifting trade patterns. Africa is also undergoing its own transformation, building the world's largest free trade area. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on this earth will be African. That's right, well, to your left and your right, every 4th person will be of African on the earth. Ships departing from Mombasa or Durban will increasingly look north, not just to Europe, but toward the new opportunities opening through the Arctic. For the United States, ignoring Africa means overlooking tomorrow's customers, partners, and competitors. We are not just a buffer, we are a gateway. Alaska's economy is deeply integrated with global value chains. Your seafood, energy, and minerals feed the US and allied markets that are also tied to Africa. African minerals such as cobalt, platinum, copper, and power American defense, aerospace, and energy industries, many which have a footprint in Alaska. The connection is not always a straight line, but Alaska and Africa are upstream partners in the same global system. Alaska is also a mining powerhouse, home to 49 of the 50 minerals deemed critical by the US government. Yet no single region can secure the energy transition alone. Africa also holds roughly 30% of the world's known mineral reserves, including the majority of global platinum and a dominant share of cobalt. Companies like South32 operate in both Southern Africa and Alaska's Ambler Metals project, pursuing the same strategic resources. Energy is another area of convergence. Firms like the ConocoPhillips and Chevron, familiar names in Alaska, run major projects in Nigeria and Angola. These companies are not just investors, they are connectors between the two continents. The strategic objective is resilience. African extraction paired with allied processing capacity helps to deter China's advantage, which is not just ownership of the resources, but dominance in trying to refine and do downstream processing. Alaska brings technical expertise in harsh environments, and Africa brings scale and supply. Together, they strengthen global resilience. So I told you there was a lot of similarities here that we're going to find and pull out. Alignment. Great power competition is often framed in binary terms. Will Africa choose Washington or Beijing? I think that's the wrong question to ask. African leaders pursue optionality, diversifying partners, avoiding overdependence, and asserting sovereignty. We know that China offers infrastructure. Russia often offers security cooperation. And the US offers transparency and now private sector scale. African governments are actively managing these relationships, not passively aligning themselves with either or. Alaska understands this balancing act. Here, Native corporations overseen by Alaska Natives govern land and resources through collective ownership and long-term stewardship. Juneau is home to the Central Council of the Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, a model of indigenous self-governance that is studied globally and resonates with African communities seeking to strengthen their own traditional governance systems. The human bridge. So trade and strategy ultimately come down to people. Many of the Black and African communities have been part of Alaska's story for over 150 years, from 19th century Black whalers in the Arctic to Buffalo Soldiers during the Gold Rush, to African American engineers building the Alaska Highway in World War II. Today, this legacy continues. Juneau and Alaska at large are home to a vibrant African diaspora, Sudanese students at the University of Alaska, Nigerian healthcare workers in Fairbanks, Ethiopian entrepreneurs in Anchorage. This community is a strategic asset, building trust and connecting Alaska's economy to global systems. And these are real examples from when I announced that I was coming to Alaska. People reached out and said, oh, I have a connection there, or I know somebody there, or I went to school there. So to me, Africa's trajectory will shape the future. Population growth, labor markets, consumption, and multilateral influence. Alaska's strategic importance will only grow as the Arctic opens and demand for resources intensifies. US policy towards Africa is shifting from aid toward investment, from counterterrorism towards resilience and partnership. Success depends on integration from military, commercial, and diplomatic engagements. Alaska's joint base here is already a part of the robust mining and energy sector community and part of that integrated approach. What I would call next is a call to action. Africa and Alaska are not afterthoughts. They are where the future is negotiated. This is not symbolism. In my mind, it is strategy. My challenge to many and to you is to stop thinking of Africa as half a world away. Look at the shipping data, the mineral markets, and the diversity of your own communities. Alaska has been known as the last frontier, but in this era, you are among the first to witness change in ice, trade, and global demand. I hope you will also be among the first to build deep, durable partnerships across Africa. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Please take advantage of the mic. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely.
I didn't hear you mention climate change once. What do we have in common? What is your vision, since you're so much younger than I am, of the future and how that's going to force us to either come together or be in pretty dangerous territory?
Yeah.
What's your vision based on the accelerating global climate change? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I'll try to do the questions either one by one so that I remember, because I'm not as young as I look. I do tend to forget them from time to time. But I think the issue that you've raised with climate change, I mentioned it once, only because it's built into what I would call the resiliency infrastructure that we need to start thinking about. Climate change here, I was able to actually witness it in visiting the Mendenhall Glacier, and I was wowed at the degradation, obviously, of the ice, something that we're all watching around the world, but what that will mean for the flooding, what that will mean for migration patterns, and the ability to be able to continue some of the industries that are here based on climate change. It's a very similar thing in Africa. And with working with a number of militaries, their biggest threat was not necessarily terrorism or a war that was going to happen on their borders. It was the invasion of locusts in their agriculture fields, which leads to climate insecurity, also food insecurity, as well as migration patterns as people seek to find water, food, and also livelihoods in new livelihoods, given that many of the traditional ones were pastoralists or they were agriculture or farming, and those are industries now that are being challenged by climate. I'd like to think that technology will help with some of these challenges, particularly in the food insecurity area that is being brought about by climate security. I've worked with a lot of countries who are looking now to bring in new types of technology, new types of seeds, different types of fertilizers that will help to build and grow more sustainable agriculture products and more sustainable farming methods. But it is a huge challenge, particularly as we're seeing in places like the Kenya Rift Valley, the droughts, the cyclones that are happening in Mozambique. It's a continuous cycle of sort of adapting to the changing climate. So resiliency, as I said, is a big word. It's something that we continue to talk about, as climate change is not always the terminology that is used, but building climate resiliency into development, infrastructure, and in new agriculture and farming practices. It's not a vision per se, but definitely something we're keeping an eye on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to Juneau. You mentioned a shift between our country providing aid and to providing investment, to investing in Africa. But I'm still so concerned about the stopping of USAID to Africa, and I read about the impact that it has. And can you talk to us a little bit about that impact?
Sure. One of the things that's not up there is, yes, I was the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense. But prior to leaving the Biden administration, I was also the Deputy CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a development agency that we had in the government that's now been folded under the State Department, but it was a complementary development agency that was alongside USAID. And while USAID managed many of the governance programs, health initiatives that many of people are familiar with, earlier we were talking about the Peace Corps, and these were all complementary programs around our type of US foreign policy through the development umbrella. We also had the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was focused on building economic growth through infrastructure and also allowing countries to determine what areas of US engagement they wanted to have outside of the traditional models of development. And it was purely focused around building economic growth and potential in countries that were looking to bring themselves out of some of the poverty index numbers. And so I use that as an example just to be able to show that we have other agencies within the US government that are doing development. As I've been going around the country, I have been really empathetic to those who have worked in USAID and have spent their life and career doing what we would call traditional development. And what I try to encourage them and see the glass half full is that the current administration is not asking us to turn away from that work. I think with the closing of USAID, we saw a really hard jolt away from the things that we know and the way that we do things. But I think there's still a way for the US to engage. We're just being asked to use a different tool. That tool for the next 4 years is being encouraged through the private sector. And there's already, I think, a surge in the amount of businesses that have been started to continue to adapt to health challenges that have traditionally been done under USAID, educational programs, and governance models. We're also seeing a step up from a number of foundations that are really key to us. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that worked very closely with USAID, Rockefeller, the Ford Foundation, all of which had footprints in Africa, have now changed a bit of their model to now fill that gap, not just from the philanthropy space, but also to join the private sector in making sure that they can buttress what has been maybe removed from the traditional USAID development model. And what I encourage students to do is be the next generation of innovative leaders. You know, when USAID was formed in 1961 under Kennedy, it was born out of our need to engage in the world post-World War II in a different way. When MCC was formed 20 years ago, they celebrated 20 years, it was to look at our engagement in development through the economic lens. And I think we'll start to see, whether it's through technology or through the private sector, a number of young Americans investing in places around the world and bringing US values from the private sector, a little bit of capitalism as well, to our foreign policy arena. So it's not a perfect way to have ended what I think has been an amazing streak of US engagement, sharing our values, democracy, governance, health, and security. But I think it is just a different way that we'll be engaging in some of those same activities through the private sector. So I know that was a long-winded.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your reference to some of the native corporation structures that we have up here in Alaska, and you mentioned that they're of interest to indigenous populations in Africa. And I'm just curious, can you maybe speak to what sorts of entities there are and structures there are in Africa that look to or might in the future tend towards the kinds of structures we've developed up here?
Sure. What comes to mind immediately is that the African continent has obviously 54 countries, but they have different sets of governance structures in different places. So you could be in the Kingdom of Lesotho, which has a king, a parliament, a traditional tribal governance structure, as well as you could be in Nigeria, which has just a very traditional Western democracy. And the different structures and the different governance models in each of them help define how they move legislation, how they spend money, and who has the power and the sort of political strength in any of the countries. And knowing each of those just kind of differs and is specific to each. The example that I'd like to take from is Lesotho. I worked in Lesotho both as a defense official and as a development official. And we found that it was increasingly important to bring together the entire group of communities, whether it was the local tribal council and the paramount chiefs, the parliamental structure, the prime minister, and then the king, when helping them devise and implement legislation that they passed that had to do with economics growth, but also in how they spread finances across the country. And in the legislative process, each of these entities has to be consulted, and each of them has to have a different, I would say, balance and weigh in to the actual process. What was interesting to me was that leaving that particular structure, where you would think that the king or the prime minister might have the final say, or even the parliament, this body in Lesotho, it was actually the paramount chiefs who had the very last final word and vote on whether legislation was passed. And so that was one example where I saw the traditional models and indigenous models be used in a Western style consultation and process, but it still was a very indigenous practice that was the final decision maker. The other that I was talking with Bruce about is the permanent fund, which is something that I know is of a little bit of a contentious topic amongst the people, but it does create the type of wealth fund that I think a lot of African countries are struggling to figure out how to manage. There's obviously been a lot of historical leftover remnants from colonialism that have left, unbalanced power structures, which have led to types of corruption. And then we see some forms of neocolonialism where we see China trying to line the pockets of presidents and those who are in power, not necessarily giving a fair trade or a fair balance to those citizens who may not be at the upper echelons of structure. And trying to figure out how to create wealth funds, pension funds, retirement programs, and benefits that are fair to all layers of the population is something that I talk to a lot of African presidents and ministers about on a regular basis. They look to the United States as a model of being able to put money into a fund that their citizens will be able to draw from. But figuring out how to keep that either growing interest in markets or being able to grow that economic wealth for the country based on the resources and the talent that they have has been a challenge. So trying to have them step away from maybe traditional colonial models and look at more or some different models that are more unique and are more aligned with how they have communities, structures, and governance before colonialism. Examples from here at places like Alaska are really important.
Thank you. I might do a follow-up with you on Lesotho. Sure. What about land ownership? So, for example, in Alaska, federal, state, indigenous tribe ownerships, private ownership. What is it like in Lesotho?
That's a really good question. This was part of what we were working on there. It was a horticulture and agriculture program that the Millennium Challenge Corporation was trying to promote to ensure that there was food security and there was equal access to farming, having a livelihood. But one of the things that we were able to bring to the attention of the various governance communities was that land was not allowed to be given to women. And so we're able to show them from data the advantages of being able to give women land and what that could produce economically for the country. And this was something that had to be changed legislatively. And it took 10 years because there's traditional sort of practices and the women don't own land and it's either passed down through your father or it's given through your husband. But as soon as we were able to show the dollars, they were like, wait a minute, we're only farming 50% of our population's land, and there were a lot of women who had land from their fathers or from their husbands. The land rights issue is something that is really specific and unique to each country. However, there are some very traditional practices, which are family-owned plots of land are normally passed down through male lineage. You have many societies like in Malawi where it is through matriarchal lineage. But you do have a really family-oriented community structure where you will have different ethnic groups or you'll have communities who own parts of the land. What you're finding now in this era of strategic competition and looking for the ability to be able to find critical minerals on certain parts of land, where you have outsiders who are understanding the cultural context of engaging with African countries and are either buying up land with just, bags of cash, or they're accepting that there is a cultural practice and they're marrying into certain cultures, and then you have sort of the traditional sort of holding the line of ensuring that only people who are citizens or nationals of the country are able to get first takes of land that are either owned by the government or they're able to buy them in from another family. So it varies across the continent, but specifically in Lesotho, we found that this was a patriarchal lineage of land ownership, but there was definitely a lot of work that was done to change and modernize some of the laws around women and land ownership. You're welcome. Hello there.
So my question is kind of a broad one, but I'll try to make it as focused as I can. So we live in a very odd time where we've lived under an international rules-based form of solving problems and developing our societies for 80 so years. That is now ending or has ended. And there's a strong push to revert to an earlier form, which is essentially great powers, might makes right form, which was a tremendous disaster for centuries for anybody who reads history. So thinking of Africa and how you describe it as a young continent and its mixture of traditional and new societies, do you see any forms of social organization and particularly conflict resolution arising there that might provide a way forward for the world?
Wow. That's not an easy question, but I definitely have some opinions on it. I've really enjoyed working with youth populations in Africa, and I know I look young to be able to say that. In Africa, youth is up to age 35, so I have a decade on that. But there is a really interesting transition that's happening, and a transformation, I would say, that's happening with youth being involved in politics. And there used to just be this sort of blanket understanding that what was happening was not really a democracy, a coup was a coup, and there were these really specific, sort of families who always stayed in power. And now you're starting to see a generation that is challenging that. You've seen a number of movements happening, the SARS movement in Nigeria, where a number of students took to the streets repeatedly for weeks and then months on end to protest police violence. And I'd like to think that that influence has come from the sharing of information and knowledge, that a lot of that has come through social media. The ability to be able to convene, the ability to be able to galvanize and protest in a way that is organized and structured has really been, I think, accelerated and maybe amplified across the continent because of this shared technology and this shared ability to be able to share information. We saw the Arab Spring happen in the early 2000s. We saw what happened in Egypt. We've seen protests in Zimbabwe and in Mozambique around elections. The youth are no longer, I think, passively sitting and allowing some of these old traditional structures to just kind of stay without question. Even the phenomenon right now, I think, around Captain Traoré in Burkina Faso, the young coup leader who has been leading the country now for, I think, a little over 2 years. No one thought that it would last this long, but the transformations and the support that he's been able to get, not just from his country and his countrymen, to bring progress of a different way to the country without just sort of lining the pockets of, old politicians, has been remarkably well received. I was doing a talk down at Texas A&M, and I said, what do you know about Africa? And someone was just like, we all know Captain Traoré, the young captain in Burkina Faso who's bringing pride and dignity and a Pan-African lens to the African continent. And so I think we'll have to look a lot at the youth for their new ways of how they will express themselves, their interest in politics, what that will look like for changing, like I said, traditional governance and traditional ways of power. We'll see new people running in elections. I think there's a resurgence of diaspora who are also going back, and they want to be a part of the economic growth and development of the continent in different ways because they feel a connection there. And so as we see all of those things sort of complement each other but also converge, I think we'll start to see Africa's leadership come in a very different way. And you mentioned sort of conflict. I think we'll see less fighting and more, this is maybe me and my optimistic hope, I'm a conflict negotiator and mediator by degree. I hope we'll see more conflict resolution through capitalism. That sounds bad. But what I mean by that is because there's trade, because there's a globalization, because there's sort of unity and connectivity, the idea of fighting for the traditional resources, diamonds, cobalt, and things like that, become less important in a more integrated, youthful society. These are really amazing questions. I don't think I could get these even from my students.
You mentioned briefly the Arab Spring, and that brought to mind earlier Pan-Arab movement, particularly in the 60s, that reflects on the Pan-African movement as well, formation of OAS. Do you see any for lack of a better term, Pan-African movement in terms of young people connecting across borders?
I think one I mentioned with Captain Traore in Burkina Faso is seemed to be able to take up a lot of interest from youthful populations. I'd also say the African Union, the OAS, as you mentioned, has an Agenda 2063, which is focused on the youth, focused on youth education, focused on promoting youth and finding jobs and opportunities for youth across the continent. And what that means is really having to delve into not just cultural African industries, like the creative industries, so fashion, music, areas that are traditionally not well paid, but putting investment and time and energy into making sure that those are livelihoods that can be well sustained. But then there's also an interest, I think, in having youth become part of this new innovative, I don't want to say revolution, but we're hearing a lot about artificial intelligence. What does that mean for data centers? Where are those data centers placed? Manufacturing and processing. So figuring out the technology around keeping jobs at home and keeping youth at home so that they don't have to migrate to other countries to try and find work and then send remittances back home. So there is a focus, I think, at the African Union to make sure that this is an integral part of their Agenda 2063. And then you have these personalities who are a representative of a new way of thinking about Africa and a new way of thinking about African leadership. And then lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't, put the role of the diaspora as an integral part of trying to help promote this as well, bringing examples from, where African diaspora have been spread across the globe, from South America to the United States to Europe, bringing a lot of that knowledge and expertise and matching and marrying it up with the youth and cultural practices to create the new types of economic growth and cultural expressions that need to be on the continent for the next generation.
Other questions? Do I get a second turn?
You can.
Is it possible, building on an earlier question, that we seem to have come to the end of the rules-based way of organizing the world? What if that's just an interruption for a few years, maybe only 2? Has the Trump administration done the world a great favor by forcing us to reconsider the order of things? And secondly, to reappreciate the kind of country that we used to be and that we would like to be and that we need to return to be. And where does Africa fit into that? We seem to say, Europe has to figure out how to do it on its own because they can't count on us anymore. Well, where does that leave Africa?
Thank you for the question. I think it's both. I am particularly glad that we have had to see another side of the United States away from its traditional model to make us realize, just as you said, what was important to us, what are our values, and what we need to stand for and maybe try and preserve. And there's some things that obviously we need to change and evolve. At the same time, I think it has allowed the rest of the world to understand that their reliance on the United States, for better or for worse, is not guaranteed. And I think this is something that only the Trump administration could do. I could, like many Americans, can see both sides of this argument. Yes, we don't need to be responsible for all of the world, and I think we have enjoyed that privilege for a very long time. But it also comes at a time where Africans are having what we call resurgence of African agency. 60 plus years after colonialism, where are Africans in standing up their own countries, their governments? Where are they when it comes to sort of health infrastructure and education, to have actual sustainable governments and actual sustainable industries, rather than just being recipients of aid or just being recipients of the extraction of their resources. When I have conversations with African leaders now, they constantly ask me, well, can we count on the deals that are being made right now? And I said, I don't know. I said, you have to think about the long-term value of what it is you're trying to do for your country. And it is causing them to think, what do I need to do differently if I don't have the United States as a determined partner? And so many of them who were focused on non-alignment, having strategic interests with certain countries because it aligned with their government's vision or their country's goals. They're tightening up some of those things. Some of them are panicking a little bit, but I'm seeing the same thing in Europe. I had a good conversation with a number of European partners who are like, well, what do we do now? The United States is not leading. I said, we've run out of bullets, men. Now we have to think. Because what Eisenhower said. So you have to give some credit to the way the Trump administration has been able to get people to think about the importance of the United States, its role and its position in the international rules-based order, and whether or not we will see an evolution of that, or if we will see a degradation and go back to an even worse position than when we were coming out of World War II. I don't know if that's fair or not.
Well, thank you. That was very good. One follow-up. What's the Millennium Challenge Corporation? Is that a private enterprise?
It is not a private enterprise, but it was designed and run like a corporation. But it was a U.S. government agency, and it still exists. It did survive, I think, some of the cuts, albeit that it is a much smaller version than what it was. But it was designed to be a really nimble infrastructure agency that focused on helping countries that were just at the cusp of being able to get out of the poverty index and maybe just needed a little bit of help. They provided grant funding for large infrastructure projects that could help tip the scale on economic growth and potential in a country. For example, they did a number of roads, they did a number of bridges, things that were monumental in sort of connecting the GDP or the economic growth potential of a country with an actual project. So it kind of did what China's doing on a large scale, but in a really niche boutique way. And we used to give grants from about $500,000 to do something really transformative that would tip the scale in the positive direction for economic growth. So they're still doing projects, roads, horticulture, agriculture, power and energy, integrating systems across the continent. 2/3 of their programs were in Africa. Some of them were in Asia and then also in South America as well. You're welcome.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, why do you think the Peace Corps survived all the cuts through the Trump administration, and do you think it will make it through the whole administration?
The Peace Corps and all of those sort of foreign policy development organizations and agencies, we were a tight-knit group. And so just speaking from my experience, there was a really fervent advocacy group that worked to try and ensure that many of these organizations and agencies kept some sort of footprint while we went through some of the, I think, legal machinations around if what was happening in the quick cuts was actually right for the country. So the short answer is really, really good programs deserve to be advocated for, and they definitely were in Washington in many different circles. And while it is maybe in a more dormant stage right now, I do believe that the Peace Corps is one of the strongest programs that the United States has for its ability to be able to share its values in a very integrated and embedded way in global communities. You will find everywhere that the Peace Corps has been, there have been positive influences, but there have been negative influences. But you will always find somebody that will remember what the Peace Corps did and what they taught them. And I've known a number of people who have moved or migrated to the United States, started Peace Corps initiative-esque programs in their countries just based on the experience that they had. And so I think that's one of the programs that has actually been able to maintain, because I think if you looked at both sides of the aisles, there will definitely be people who have seen the advantages of this type of small foreign policy engagement that can have a really big impact.
Well, I like your optimism and your thought that we might see some terrific growth over the next several years through what you call capitalism, capitalistic development. But you know, looking at the situation, I mean, we see that a lot of people, a lot of industry would like to get out of China, like Apple, for example, building the iPhones in China. But no one's talking about bringing that kind of industry development to Africa. And why not? And what's the impediment? Is it lack of stable governments? Is it lack of sufficient infrastructure? And how long is it going to be till maybe we might see that?
This is a great question to end on, because I could probably spend 30 minutes talking about this, because this is one of the big issues that I'm hoping I'll be able to shift in having sort of educative seminars like this. And what it comes down to is labor, training labor, education, and then also manufacturing and processing facilities. The cost of doing or having an Apple facility in China right now is always going to be cheaper than bringing it back to the United States. That being said, there hasn't been a lot of consideration for this demographic that is growing in Africa. You know, 1 in 4 people on the earth will be African with the growth that's happening. So what are we doing to prepare that generation to be the talent that is needed to be the manufacturing and processing employees of many of these global companies? And I think a lot of that is just an unfamiliarity with Africa, understanding what and where the best places are to invest. Yes, there is a component of security and stability in certain countries and in their economics that is important, but that's kind of what things like my firm do. We help bridge that gap between understanding the complexities of Africa's markets, where's the best place to invest, where's the best place for a cell phone business or Uber to maybe try and get a footprint. But what you do have is 54 different markets at multiple levels that are just ripe for investment if you have the patience and you have the time and a little bit of a risk appetite depending on where you go. Now, these are all things that I think we haven't educated a lot of Americans on, and so I'm often called and asked, well, I wanted to invest in Burundi, and I'm just like, well, why did you choose Burundi? It's like, well, I knew a student in my class who was from Burundi, and there's no sort of data around it, and there's no due diligence or feasibility studies that says, okay, whatever your business is ripe for Burundi's markets, or vice versa. And so doing more exchanges, understanding a little bit more about Africa. I, grew up with there being very few classes about Africa in the universities. I taught a class at Georgetown about, African security studies from the African perspective. And my students were always, just floored that we never touched any Western literature in the class. Everything was from the African Union security architecture or talking about multilateral institutions in Africa, African authors. It had never occurred to them that there was another way to look at it outside of the US or Chinese strategic competition lens. And so educating more Americans about Africa, African countries, nations, markets, and the way that we did during the Industrial Revolution for Asia is going to be critically important. You know, I, in graduate school, learned about high and low culture. There are no classes that teach you that in Lesotho you have to go through a 4-governance structure from the king right down to the parliamentary court to, you know, doing a regular democracy in Nigeria, but the power is really in the statehood, not in the federal government. So having these exchanges, having these understandings, and then really having someone who understands and knows how to help you enter into those markets is going to be key. But there has to be a different lens and a narrative around Africa that has been traditionally shown, and that's shown, you know, National Geographic, you've got your safaris, and the omission, as we were talking about in the rules-based order, of 54 countries from 193 United Nations structure and global structure, from financial markets, from you know, Bretton Woods structures. There has to be integration of Africa in all of these arenas and all of these multilateral organizations and all of these finance spaces for that to be a true contender in where I think America will put its investments. We just have to have an appetite also for then, like, everybody wants a 2 to 3 year return, and I'm like, or a 10-year return. You just got to be patient. So, thank you. It's a great question to end on.
That was Chidi Blyden in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded February 3rd, 2026 at KTOO in Juneau. JWAC presentations are supported by season sponsors, Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Wassman and Associates, Ramada Inn, and Jim Clark.